Hello and welcome to dentReviews. Tonight I want to do a review of the Moondrop Lan. I've had this for quite a while now, so I'm very familiar with this sound. Mark over at Super Review sent me his pair to loan for a while. Ended up being a month, and then 2 months, and then 6 months, and then it's been a while. It's been since that last video that I did with him with the blind shootout. So now that I've had a lot of time to acclimate myself to this, I'm going to give you my impressions and kind of an in-depth review. I'll try to keep it as short as possible. This is the Moondrop Lan. Now, if you're familiar with Moondrop, they've kind of entered the IEM scene with a lot of different price ranges of IEMs, but they really tend to do well in the budget sector. They have a lot of IEMs that are between $20 to $100, and they're just hitting it out of the park with the frequency response and the quality of the drivers and the housing and the cables. I mean, they're phenomenal values. So how does the Lan fit into that lineup of IEMs? Well, first things first, it comes in at about $40, I believe, $39 on linsol.com. You can probably get it on Amazon as well. This is a it's a single dynamic driver, but it has a dual dynamic cavity. So there's like two cavities inside that kind of control the acoustics of the sound. It's a 32 ohm impedance, roughly, and it has 120 decibels of sensitivity, and it has the typical Moondrop 0.78 2-pin connector, which I like. It's got your standard Moondrop blob here on the cable, which I'm not a huge fan of. It's okay. It doesn't really get in the way in actual use, but I think it's completely unnecessary and way too big. It doesn't have any kind of a cord lock, so I usually just make my own. I just tape a piece of paper or something around it. It works really well, actually. It's got a pretty nice right angle connector here. It's fairly compact and elongated, so it'll fit into any phone case here with this narrow tube there. And it's got kind of your typical cheap flex here for cord relief. Nothing amazing. It's okay. It's got a twisted appearance, but it's in a single kind of sheath. So that's kind of nice. I like that myself, like the Etymotic ER2 versus the ER4. I like the single sheaths kind of feel of the cable. And has a nice look to it. Again, 2-pin connector, and it comes into what I believe is a stainless steel housing. I'm not positive. I don't really care to check. I should have done my homework, but it's kind of like a stainless steel housing. It looks very, very reminiscent of the Moondrop Chew, but in my opinion, a nicer kind of a matte silver finish, a little butterfly triangle thing there. It's got 2 bass ports and kind of a typical Moondrop metal nozzle there, filter, and it comes with a standard Moondrop ear tips. So that's the build quality. Nothing special to write home about, but for $40, it's actually pretty good. I would actually argue that the cable itself, which I didn't mention, has some right color marking there, so you can differentiate the left and right easily. That cable is pretty nice looking and feels fairly nice and pretty durable for the price. So just at the entry price of $40, it's almost worth it for the cable. I've seen $50, $60, $70, $100 cables that are not as nice as this. Sure, they might be durable, but they're fat and they're thick. This is a nice, slim, sleek, well-made cable. So that's a good bonus there. The housings feel pretty durable. In my personal fit, they're pretty comfortable. They just loop around the ear, and they fit nicely into my concha and the whole area of my ear there. I don't feel any pressure anywhere with them. I can wear them for a long period of time, and I don't have any problems with comfort. So enough of that. What do they sound like? You know me. The main thing in my reviews is the sound quality. And this is I'm going to try to keep this short because there's so much I want to say about these, but I don't want to sound like I'm a broken record here. So basically, the Moondrop Lan is probably, as of the writing of this review, without a shadow of the doubt, one of the most neutral frequency responses in an earphone for less than $50, even $100. They hit my dentReview target fairly well. Couple little niggles there, but they're very overall linear. If you look at my graph on dent.reviews, you can pull up the Moondrop Lan and you can pull it up against my target by clicking on dentReviews under targets. You'll see that if you actually click on the squiggly line next to my target in the bottom where it says target and it shows 0 and there's a squiggly line and a little visible eye, you can neutralize the graph to my target. So to show my target as a flat line, and then after it'll overlay any IEMs on top of that to show how they differ from my target. So if you do that with the Lan, you'll notice that there's a little bit of a dip in the uttermost bass, like the super sub bass. Then there's a little bump in the kind of lower bass, maybe a little bit into the mid bass. It's fairly neutral in the mids, and then the treble. there might be a little bit of a bump in the treble somewhere, and there's kind of up and downs in the upper treble, which I've said this before, but you got to take that with a grain of salt because a lot of these measurement rigs, most people would agree that above 10 kilohertz measurements probably aren't as accurate as they could be. But in my hearing, I've had pretty good consistency with my measurement microphone in my ears, so be that as it may. The point being, if you look at that graph, it's overall very well lining up with my dent review target with those small deviations. Now, how do those deviations matter? Well, the bass I'd say is pretty good. By far not the most perfect bass I've ever heard in an IEM. However, they're definitely on the linear side. They have good sub-bass extension. They hit tightly. They have a good bass character to them. They don't have any like mid-bass bloat that distracts from details. They don't have any excessive sub-bass that makes it sound overly bearing. They just sound very good. You know, could they be more perfect in the bass? Yes, but I'd say for the price and even compared to more expensive sets, they're actually one of the more neutral and professional sounding bass tunings. The treble, I'd say, errs a little bit on the forward side. The treble is very linear and smooth. I don't have any issues with treble in terms of peaks or dips. There's nothing drastic. However, they do have a little tiny bit of a nasal quality to them, maybe a forwardedness in the, I don't know if it's 4K, but maybe around that area, 4 kilohertz, followed by maybe a dip, and it kind of exaggerates that and makes it sound like an aspect of the treble is a little more in your face. Now, with the linear bass, which I would normally say is excellent, that treble combination and the balance between them makes these have a little bit more of a forward-leaning, brighter sound, whereas the bass gets a little bit put back in the mix. Not that it doesn't have great bass, and if you listen, it does hit well, extends deep, and sounds linear, but it's a little bit overshadowed by the overall treble balance, and what that causes is more of a thin character to the IEM. Now, this can be affected by the tips, because depending on the seal you're going to get with your ear tip, it's going to depend on how much of that bass is kind of showing through. So with the best tips that I can get sealed, they kind of match my response that I see, where it's very neutral, great bass, no complaints, but just a little bit of a treble forward-leaning signature. So what does that mean when you're listening to music? Well, I would say that for most music, it's going to sound clinical, if that's the right word. You're going to hear a lot of nuances, a lot of details. But if you put things that are aggressive into your ears, so if you have a lot of like heavy metal, electronic EDM, really anything like that that's really aggressive with a lot of bright transients and grungy sound, these might come off sounding a little bit on the harsh side. It's not that they aren't relatively accurate, but that just slight forward treble leaning sensation is going to make things a little more fatiguing. So I would say that these are probably not the ideal IEMs for aggressive music listeners. I'd also say they're also definitely not the IEM for bass heads for two reasons. First, as I mentioned, they're not really overly bassy by any means. They're more on the neutral side and lean neutral at that. But I've also done a lot of experimentation, and I've written about this a little bit in some of the forums and on the Discord, but the bass of these, while it is very neutral and sounds very good, because of that treble forwardness, I personally like to have a little bit more bass to kind of balance it out, which ultimately might give you technically a more of a U-shaped response, just slightly. But it just sounds a little bit more correct to my ears to have the bass and the treble balanced in their overall kind of respective levels. The only way to do that would be either equalization or modification. So these have two bass vent ports on these, and I have done extensive testing with ear tips and bass port blocking, because there is a known mod where if you block the inner bass port near the nozzle here, it will increase the bass in a pretty good curve, actually. It goes kind of up in a sloping upward curve to the sub bass, which adds a lot of deep bass, but not too much mid bass. So it does add a sense of fullness and a little bit more punch in the bass, which I really like a lot. The problem that I have with this modification is I believe that the way that this driver and this earphone was designed is that they really kind of capitalized on the airflow due to the acoustic nature, like the dual cavity and how they constructed it with the bass ports here, that when you block one of those bass ports, you may not realize it, but there is some air escaping through the ear tip. Even with a perfect ear tip, there's some level of air leakage. Well, with a tip that seals really well, that doesn't allow hardly any air to leave and creates sort of a vacuum in other sense. The bass part would normally allow some relief there so that when you put the ear tip in, you don't get a vacuum. The bass sounds good. The driver can flex and move properly. In my case, if I block that bass port, I use some Moondrop tips here. These are the spring tip tips. I use these. In my particular case, they block the best. They seal really, really well. But when the bass port is blocked, there's no air allowed to move through the bass port, and there's no air allowed to move, relatively speaking, through the ear tip. So what happens is the driver struggles to move. Now, what I can do to mitigate that is if I put the ear tip in and basically wait a while and kind of finagle the ear tip up and down to allow like a seal to cause some air out, ear escape, and to basically neutralize that vacuum pressure so there's no pulling or pushing sensation. When I do that, and if I can get that just right, the bass mod sounds good and everything works as intended. The problem I have is that if I were to put the ear tip in my ear, even the slightest vacuum, you can hear that it causes the driver to basically cease to function properly. It's like it gets pulled and it can't relapse back and move properly. So the sound is completely crippled, not distorted. It doesn't add any kind of distortion. It's just the driver itself is crippled. So it sounds as if it's far away and muffled and just not working properly. It's unlistenable. So you can kind of fidget it and move it and try to get it right, but I found that it was just not worth the effort in my case. So I needed to do one of two things. One, use an ear tip that allowed a little bit more airflow, but that somewhat negated the bass mod and reduced the bass back to relatively normal levels. Or I just don't use the bass mod at all and have EQ. Now, EQ does very well with these. I would argue that it's still not capable of perfect bass, even with equalization, and I don't know if that's an excursion thing, limited to the driver performance. I have no idea. I just know that EQ handles really well, and it sounds good, and you can get extra bass, no distortion, no problem. But comparing it to an IEM that has more precise, punchy, tactile bass, this never really sounds to that degree. So I would say that for the price, $40, these are in my absolute top tier earphones. If you don't want to spend $100, $100+, but you want a relatively neutral sound, maybe you don't mind a little bit of a leaning towards bright, then I would highly recommend it. I wouldn't even question. Don't look at anything else. Just buy these. Now, if you want something that's fun and engaging, I think there are better sets. There's that, forgive me, my memory's bad, the MechWarrior C2, I think was the name of it. I found that sounded a little bit more energetic than this and maybe a little bit more revealing in some ways, but maybe not as clinically linear. But it was just more fun to listen to, and I think it still was linear enough that that's a great set. But if you want something that's more clinically linear, a little bit more towards like an edemotic leaning or something with a nice, smooth, clean response, these are phenomenal at $40. The cable, the tips, the housing, the sound quality, I think it's just an excellent, excellent deal. I don't hear any flaws in them. I don't hear any problems. They're a little bit adjustable with that bass mod if you feel like spending the time to try to get that tweak just right. They handle EQ reasonably well. They're fairly sensitive, so they're easy to drive with any device that you give at them. So I would say that's a wrap, I guess. That's just all I can say is they're phenomenal for the price. Are they the best I've ever heard? No. Are they one of the best I've ever heard? In some regards. And I really do think that a lot of that comes down to the design of the acoustics in the chamber and the driver performance itself. And I don't know enough about, I'm talking from experience and listening and how I perceive the sound. I don't know enough about the technical engineering aspect of the IEMs to know why, but I do know that there are other IEMs that are similar in response, like the Kato. The Kato has, in my opinion, a worse bass response than this. It has more mid-bass, which means that the mid-bass gives you a fuller bass sound perhaps, but also masks a little bit of the upper frequency response. And the Moondrop Kato also has a little bit more of a peak up in the higher treble. But despite that, the Kato sounds more high-def, more refined, and has tighter bass. Now, if you were to EQ these both to match my target, which I can do using some of the software on Super Reviews, he has an EQ like compensation graph, and if I equalize them to both match my target, they sound very similar in response, but the Kato still sounds more high definition and more tactile. So the only thing I can put that down to is the driver. And I would like to think there's a reason that costs $200 and something is because the $40 driver is just not able to compete with the $200 something driver. And maybe that's not true. Maybe it's something else. But I've yet to be able to get these to match the Kato in the high-def listening experience that they are able to provide with proper EQ. Or even without EQ. I still think I'd prefer the Kato over the Lan. They're close, though, because the Lan does have smoother treble and more linear bass. And even though it doesn't have that same tactile high-def experience, the neutral response really does lend itself to kind of revealing an equal amount of detail across the spectrum. Things sound balanced in the mix the way they're supposed to sound. The Kato is not far off, don't get me wrong, but I don't like the mid-bass bloat in the Kato compared to the Lan and the treble. Also, it sounds a little bit more maybe Harman-tuned than the Lan, if you'd call it that. Not that it's really a Harman-tuned IM, but so I'll just end by saying that I think that these might only be held back literally by the very slight lack of driver performance, whereas the design, the response, and all the aspects of the sound are phenomenal. So it is $40. It's hard to complain. And again, I wouldn't hesitate. But if you want something a step up from this, I do think the Kato would be a step up. I think the MechWarrior C2 is a nice sidestep maybe, but with a little bit more engaging sound, a little bit more bass and treble tactility as well. And I'm going to review a couple other earphones that are similar response to this soon that are much more expensive, but they also best this in a couple ways, so stay tuned for that. But that's the Moondrop Lan. If you guys have any questions about it, feel free to give me a comment in the video below here, and I'll try to get back to you. But as always, I appreciate you guys watching. Please like and subscribe, and I'll catch you on the next one.